Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes.
It is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I am Ana Maria Mijaos from Ford Foundation, and we are in this session on livable cities, ciudades habitables in Spanish. The panel is in English, but I wanted to welcome you in Spanish.
Are interested in cities and you're interested in the process of urbanization and also in policy and this vague concept of livability. And so I'm very pleased that you're here. We're going to unpack what this concept of livability is a quality of life, is a dignity, how do we get there, and how do we develop policies, data collection that will help us to not just measure but monitor and implement in ways that are more accessible. I think there's a big echo. Is there an echo? It's okay? Okay. I had the opportunity to chat with our terrific panelists this morning, and it's going to be such a treat because the panel that we've arranged for you this afternoon is going to look at global issues around cities, the global processes, and how global institutions like development banks are helping us to think about how to do this implementation on the ground, how to do the learning, the scaling, the financing. We're then going to learn from a governor's perspective what works and what didn't work, and we're going to learn from the perspective of a municipality as well. And finally, we're going to close off with Monica, who will talk about different opportunities at the city level that are working, not just in Colombia, where she comes from, but really all across Latin America. As I said, I'm Ana Maria Lagos, and I am from the Ford Foundation. We're a social justice foundation, and we are headquartered in New York, but we have offices all around the world. We have 10 offices, including here in Mexico City. I'm glad to be able to note my role as a moderator is not just to keep us all on time and ask provocative questions, but also to make sure that you all have time to ask questions of our panelists. So I'm going to be a little bit maybe forward in my cutting the panelists if they go too long, because I want to be able to make sure that we ask them questions. So if you guys will all bear with me, that's our agreement, and we're going to go with that. A little bit about the Ford Foundation. For those of you who know us, we are a foundation that has focused for the past 50 plus years on social justice. Our new strategy, which some of you might have been reading about, is a strategy that puts inequality and the drivers of inequality at the center of our work. So I was very pleased to hear a lot of the conversations in the plenaries this morning that we're looking at inequality. For us, we see, and the OECD has confirmed in its many research products, that inequality is really harmful, not just to social policy and to social stability, but to economic growth and to health and a whole host of other things that we feel make cities and communities livable. Excuse me. And so it's not a trade-off whether we address policies and put in place policies that address inequality, or if we focus on creating jobs and creating green growth and strong growth. All of these systems are interlinked together. The work that we're doing looks at what we're calling the 7 drivers of inequality, and those range from inclusive economies to internet freedom, to gender and ethnic disparities, governance, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and my shop, which is the Equitable Urbanization Shop, and it's I think what we're going to also focus on today. And equitable urbanization looks at not just the interdependent systems of economy and environment and social systems, but also looks at governance. It looks at the linkages between urban and rural, which I hope somebody will talk about in their comments. And it looks at all of the spatial aspects of a city. The spatial aspects of a city which bake in or lock in access to opportunity, access to all sorts of things like housing, like transport, like jobs, for not just one generation, but often for several generations as well. And so we're looking at urbanization as a process in Latin America and in the US and in Europe where it has already happened, and how do we deal with the mistakes that we have made. But we're also looking at places in Africa and Southeast Asia where the process of urbanization really is up on the cusp, and we're just starting to urbanize. And we can't stop urbanization. We know that it's important for people to have the choice to migrate to urban places where there's agglomeration of opportunity, but we want that choice and that process to happen in a way that is equitable and that gives them opportunities and access. So what we're going to be focused on in this process of urbanization from the Ford Foundation perspective is not just linking equity to land use, land markets, but also housing, transit, planning, and all these other things that really our panel will talk about because they're all interlinked. With that, I think we'll get started, and I think we'll start with Ellis to give us the perspective from the bank and why the Inter-American Development Bank created the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative. What was the impetus, where you saw the gap, and also if you could talk a little bit, because the initiative now has several years under its belt, and so you've learned some lessons, and which could be shared with the group. So thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. Muy buenas tardes. Un placer estar nuevo.
Good afternoon. I am very happy to be in Guadalajara, in this city with so many memories here. The Ibero-American Development Bank has worked in Guadalajara in different sectors: education, infrastructure, and technology, of course. My presentation, please.
Bank's response to two phenomena that are impacting gravely the quality of life, the sustainability, and the competitiveness of our cities in Latin America: the rapid urbanization and the climate change. It is a technical assistance and financing program aimed at intermediate cities. It started back in 2011, and right now, in our 5th year, we have added already cities up to 55 cities are now in the program. We run our pilot in 2011, and now in the 4th year, in the 5th year, we have 55 cities. We've been able to really work together with local development banks in the middle-income countries to really convert this into a regional public good. This is more or less the way in which the program has been expanding. So by the end of the year, we'll have 55 cities impacting 53 million people. The program is built around 3 dimensions: an environmental and climate change sustainability, where you have all your indicators that deal with mitigation, adaptation, solid waste, water sanitation, and so on. A second dimension that is the urban sustainability, where you have all indicators that deal with land use, urban planning, connectivity, mobility. And a third, probably the most complicated one, which is fiscal sustainability and governance. As you know, without a sovereign guarantee. More recently, we are adding now a 4th dimension in the 3rd edition of the methodology early next year, which are 36 indicators that deal with competitiveness. At the end of the day, and we'll see this later, what we're finding out is that generating a dignified job is what the question is about in order to make a city sustainable in the long term. More recently, in the new Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, Goal 11 addresses directly life and quality of life in cities. The program is built around two components or two deliveries. One is the action plan, which is a sustainable development plan for the city with interventions that they need to make in order to be able to improve the indicators. That's the easy part. And the second is the execution, where we have to mobilize the long-term financing for these interventions to be realized. That's the difficult part. We have added climate change as a very important component of urban planning. And we'll see later that as we get more and more migration to these cities, and this migration has no human capital, no financial assets, and they need to locate themselves in the areas with lesser cost, these are the more vulnerable areas to climate change effects and to climate change disasters. The metrics are more or less as follows. We were in the 50s only 42% urbanized. Today we're 82% urbanized in Latin America. 2 weeks ago in New York, when they were discussing the Sustainable Development Goals, the worry is that the world is becoming urbanized. Today, the rate of urbanization worldwide is 53%. It will get to 80% in 2050. Latin America is already there. If you see some of the metrics of the urban footprint measures of the cities in our program, you'll find cities where the urban footprint has been growing at 7, 8, 9, and 10% per year. What it means in terms of arithmetics is that you have a new city every 6 or 7 years. This has superseded any capacity of planning that our cities have, let alone the provision of public services and the provision of services such as health and education. This is Tegucigalpa. In 40 years, it has multiplied the 33 times. We now have included climate change, and that's where the link between rapid urbanization and climate change is in the vulnerable areas. And obviously, when we have natural disasters, the heavy amount, the lion's share of those effects go to the poor people. We have developed in the program some very interesting instruments for mayors, where we're able to predict the way in which the urban footprint will grow under a more passive scenario where you do nothing, more tendential, and where a more smart scenario where you apply land regulation. And then we have built there the future cost of infrastructure. This is the city of Mar del Plata. On an inertial scenario, that's how the urban footprint will grow. And the amount of infrastructure investment is closer to $500 million. If they do a smart scenario, that amount of required investments goes down 3 times. It's the indicators that we use and the sort of methodology. We now have been able to have a strategic partnership with 7 local development institutions that have allowed us to really expand the program. A lot of strategic partnerships with private sector, academic institutions, foundations, and donors. A glimpse. We have 30 cities that have completed action plans. The amount of investments they will need just to do the prioritized interventions is around $17 billion. To prepare and to be able to access the market to get this financing, they need $500 million only in pre-investment, only just to prepare the projects. According to this, in terms of sectors, 70% of this is urban infrastructure, hardcore, 20% is urban redevelopment, and 10% is what we call soft investments in finance, sustainability, fiscal, and digitalization of public services. Just a glimpse of my point about the city's accessing financial markets. To sustain a 4% economic growth, which is really not enough to be able to make a big dent on poverty, at the city level, at the subnational level, we will need around $150 billion per year worth of investments. Mind you, these are what we call brown investments. This doesn't have the adaptation component that it would require. We calculate that at around 40 or 50 billion. In a good year of private capital flows, in a very good year of private capital flows, around 30 billion worth of these investments is actually made. And it's not like you start next year from zero. You start from a negative. These are the 30 cities we have. And now I'm going to give you a glimpse of the kind of things we propose and the impact that it has on sustainability and competitiveness. And let me perhaps pick only 2 or 3. Campeche, which is a city in Mexico, in the South Mexico. Campeche is a city that has been declared national patrimony of the world, national heritage of the world. It's a fortified city. Because investments have not been made on time, the bay is not sanitized. The bay is contaminated. And that has basically impacted that the city life happens after the fortification, inside. It's a city that is really not using that very high value environmental asset that is the Bahía de Campeche. So part of the proposal in the action plan is to sanitize the bay, basically build the drainage in the water treatment plants, and our expectations is that that whole strip, which is about 20 kilometers long, about 1 kilometer wide, will develop commercially and residentially, and probably with the land value capture that the city and the government of the state will get, will be enough to pay for the investments. Same thing in Mar del Plata, the tourism capital of Argentina. The most precious environmental assets is their beaches. Once their beaches get contaminated, nobody's going to go there. And so we're building now, because this was one of the first cities in the program, the water sewage treatment plant that will treat the dirty water and bring it to the sea. And in Tegucigalpa, which is a very complicated city with a lot of problems of security, has a river that divides the city into two, Comayagüela. In the Mitch, that river flooded, it floods every other time, and besides the economic harshness that it puts on the city, the losses of human lives are also very high, no? So we are sanitizing the river, building a linear park, adding public spaces, redensificating the center historic, and putting cameras, TV, and security measures in order to give the people from Tegucigalpa a new centrality that they can appreciate and probably impacting the citizen culture. And to close, the things we've learned these 5 years, this business of looking at a city in an integral way is becoming a regional public good, thanks to the association we have with local development institutions in Mexico with Banobras. First is that we need to have an integrated approach to the way we look at cities. We have to forget about the silos mentality. A city is not just urban transport or the water treatment plant or the public spaces of the city or the sports and the culture. It's more of an integrated vision of what kind of city we want to have in the future. And it should involve not just the local government, but all the main stakeholders there, civil society, local academic institutions, private sector. It's definitely not only important, it's necessary to embed climate change as part of the city planning. We need to understand climate change in order to be able to plan for our city. Cities have to be built around people. At the end of the day, that's what life is about. Unfortunately, most of our cities in the last 2 or 3 decades have been built around cars. In our metrics, the amount of public space that is divided between cars and citizens is probably 75% for cars, 25% for citizens. That is not a healthy model. We need to progress to a model that builds cities around the people. If you have a city that is not fiscally sustainable, a city that has a low governance, a city that cannot be a credible partner for the private sector, a city where still their citizens have to go into the ayuntamiento to be able to run all their public services processes, a city that is not digitalized, a city that is not really using technology to be able to have a most efficient management of the city, that city is not credible. That city is going to have a tough time attracting investments. 50 years ago, we have, particularly in Latin America, which is a continent surrounded by beautiful environmental assets, coast, rivers, lakes.
Because of our difficulties, we've been converting these environmental assets into depositories of solid waste. We've been contaminating the waters. And we're basically not doing a good job to be able to leave these environmental assets for the generations of the future. Mobility cannot be understood as a silo concept. Mobility and the city are part of the same thing. You need to plan mobility around how the city is going to grow and around what is your vision of that city. Security. As you know, Latin America is the champion of insecurity. We have, among the 50 most violent cities in the world, 41 of those cities are in Latin America. We need to really take this seriously. We need to involve technology, very high technology, build integrated monitoring centers, really bring back security to the people. Other than that, it will be very difficult for that city to be sustainable and competitiveness. And the last but not the least, a city where you commute to work is 2 hours, and the same thing back. A city that has very slow connectivity, where your download times is 5, 6, 7 times what it is in the United States or Europe. A city with very poor air quality. A city with a high degree of violence and organized crime. A city where the garbage is not picked up on time. A city that is not fiscally sustainable, that is not a credible partner. That city is not only sustainable, but it's not competitive. And a city that is not competitive is going to have very difficult time attracting investments. And if you don't attract investments, it's going to be very difficult to generate productive jobs, dignified jobs. And what we know for sure, we're not sociologists, but the migration from the rural side is going to continue. Whether in Latin America, in Africa, or in East Asia or in the Middle East, people don't want to stay in the rural areas. People want to migrate to cities. And what we're seeing now, a second factor, we're seeing also migration urban to urban. We're seeing people in the large metropolis, like Mexico migrating to Puebla and to Toluca, or like Sao Paulo migrating to Campinas, no? So if people keep on coming to the cities, but they don't have productive jobs, they need to go into the informality in order to be able to eat. And from southern Colombia to northern Mexico, the correlation between informality and organized crime is brutal. So when I was hearing my good friend Eduardo Sojo this morning about the welfare and the well-being indices, really, a dignified job is a big thing. It's a big step in trying to be happy and trying to feel that you are someone that society respects and that you can even, maintain your family. It's a very important, and it's very linked to the sustainability and the competitiveness of a city. We have mobilized, in terms of long-term financing, around $4 billion. And just to close, and it's not my words, it was Jeffrey Sachs 2 weeks ago, if the world is going to become urbanized, and we have such a stiff goal to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, 15 years from now, we need to do it at the city level. If we don't do it at the city level, the aggregate is not going to add up. It's not going to sum. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Alice. I really appreciated your 7 lessons learned. They were really important, and I think that we'll pick up on those during the question and answer. And also, you're lifting up the informal economy, because that also spills over into housing, into jobs. Often these people are criminalized because they're forced into the informal economy, and it perpetuates then a lack of opportunity. Our next speaker is somebody who knows a lot about this. The former governor of the beautiful state of Guanajuato, the Honorable Carlos Medina Plasencia, is going to talk about how we drill down to a governor level. What can governors do at their level that will really impact opportunity and quality of life? So, Your Honor.
Les molesto si me permiten el control para ir pasando la presentación. Gracias. Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes. Quisiera...
Good afternoon. Well, this is the first slide of my presentation. First of all, I would like to share with you that I am a businessman, and I have been for 30 years participating in politics. And I devoted to politics aside from business. And what I want to share with you today doesn't have anything to do with efficiency or doesn't have anything to do with some other things that have to do with productivity on the use of government or resources at a government level. But I wish to share with you something that emerged in León and that then we generated in Guanajuato with a new concept of government. And so after 8 years, we reached the ISO 18091. That is the first standard that Mexico has pushed forward and the first that has to do with local governments. This starts from a government concept that calls for an involvement between society and government. This is the concept of governance and the empowerment of society to make decisions together. And this that we empirically started developing several years ago has support that is worth mentioning and worth sharing with you. And that has to do with the fact that beyond transparency and efficiency, we need to build trust of society in governments. So today in Mexico, among other places, political parties, governments, and people sometimes are questioned, and this happens worldwide. And so this calls for building trust. The ISO 1891 was prepared in order to build trust in governments and to build trust in citizens and build them ourselves. The ISO 18091 emerged from the IWA4 of the ISO that now has given rise to a new paradigm on how to accompany local governments with measurable indicators. And this, together with a new paradigm, includes new focuses that goes beyond public policies and the quality in the management and the universal minimum needs of human beings, as well as information technology and governmental efficacy, as well as the involvement of the organized society. On February 10, 2014, the 18091 was created for local governments. This new international standard can contribute with a map that allows us to understand the government, locate and manage projects, and allows us to see the participation of our citizens in a concept that we believe that we should have as much organized society and as much involvement of the government in the energy as long as it is strictly needed, and that it should focus involvement in the unexplored arena of local governments. Without a map like this, and I'm talking about the 18091, democratic governments would touch the surface, but will never have access to the transversal possibilities and the horizontal and vertical nature of public policies that are demanded for greater efficiency. The 18091 has become an international standard to be applied at a local government level worldwide, and has the following characteristics that makes it special and unique. It is a map, a road map for the government and for society. It is a visor that allows us to see management not only of the government but of the society as a whole. It is an ordering force that sets the strategies to be followed, not only by government but by society. and it is also a language because it allows us to have a clear allocation of tasks at a society and government level. It is an integrator, a systemic integrator, because all of the concepts has a clear identification of the measurable environments to see whether the traffic light is green, amber, or red. So it is a new paradigm. What does this imply? What does this represent? It is the initial effort by ISO with respect to governments. It contributes to standardize and evaluate activities of local governments at an international level, and it guides the action of citizens so that they can trust in their government. And this has to do with a planning scheme in the following way at a local government level. On the one hand, we have policy and quality, and on the other hand, we have the local agenda that was contemplated in the International Workshop Agreement that gave rise to the 18091. In this plane, we can see that the integral quality program has to do with aspirations and projects by local governments, and also by the members of at a municipality, at a local level, with the heads of the areas, and also with technical, environmental, and quality standards of the 18091, among other ISOs, and with the creation of laws and decrees, but above all, on where should policies be aimed at, where should that work from the authority should be aimed at in order to achieve true social involvement. So, at the FIDEGOC that I have presided for, or that I presided for several years, it provides a diagnosis for reliable local governments. So it has a green traffic light for acceptable practices, for a government to be trustworthy. Based on this ISO, the 39 indicators that are broken down in over 100 sub-indicators, each and every one of them is in green. If not, it cannot be a reliable government. Yellow is below acceptable practice, and red is an unacceptable practices. This standard is divided into 4 quadrants. First, horizontal activities for a good government in terms of rules, regulations, but at the same time, what is the economic development, sustainable economic development for that community, inclusive social development, and environmental development as well. So these are the 4 areas, the 4 quadrants, and they include 39 indicators. I'm not going to go to each and every one of them because I only have 14 minutes. But anyways, I wish to tell you that we have over 270 sub-indicators, and each sub-indicator calls for agreement between society and governments in order to include actions by the governments. On the first one, we are talking about institutional development for governance. It has to do with responsible, well-organized government for quality management, associated, solidary, and linked with society. And we have all these indicators that have to do with governance. Number 2, we have 8 indicators for sustainable economic development that have sub-indicators that will then allow us to assess the government. Likewise, for number 3, inclusive social development and sustainable environmental development. And this allows us to apply this model on how to assess, how to accompany the government from the federal and state and municipal government level, together with society and together with citizenship. Now, this focus allows citizens to measure and verify results, and in order to do this, we have created an observatory for reliable governments. And this observatory of Leon, I am a member of it, will soon turn 6 years old. And in 6 years, we have clearly defined how is it that each and every indicator should be negotiated between the government and communities using the observatory. Now we have the citizen participation model based on the ISO 1891214, an observatory with an ISO focus in order to build reliable government with reliable citizens. General principles: it has to do with the public interest. It does not defend private interests. It guarantees the participation of citizens, generates quality information on hard data, and it issues alerts on consequences for non-compliance or absence of attention. It is impartial and inclusive, autonomous, involves and commits society and the government, and citizens can measure and verify results. It contributes to the construction of a common agenda of all stakeholders. It offers an upwards view of the government and observes society and the government integrally. There are several basic rules with operation and behavior rules with observatories, and in an inclusive way the organized community and society can take part. Now, active participation of citizen boards from the observatory. Here we have an active involvement with respect to claims and complaints. Then participation in reflections and proposals from citizens, and a third level where active involvement takes place for immediate solutions. Number 4, active involvement on strategic solutions, and active participation in better practices for each level of government. I wish to stress that ISO 1891 only talks about the minimum in green that should be met for each and every indicator. We still have to move forwards towards better practice with respect to benchmarking for each and every service. To make a long story short, the observatory disseminates participation of citizens with government at each different level for the implementation of measures. It identifies and analyzes quality and quantity of services and relationships between government and the people. Who take part? The observatory, that is autonomous from the government, of course, board members and citizens and members for each of the quadrants with specialties and with knowledge of each and every one of these quadrants, indicators, and the municipal government that is responsible for providing public services. We have regidores and heads of different institutions. So beyond transparency and efficiency, syndicate members or syndicos, as well as government members, should ensure citizen involvement. So today and last Saturday we started with the syndicos at the mayor's office in León, and more than 20 years ago I was a regidor, and 27 years I was mayor of León, and now I am convinced and motivated with the 1891, convinced that we can achieve true involvement and empowerment of society so that governance can come true in a government like the one of León. Thank you very much. Bueno, aquí estamos
Building the trust and rebuilding the compact between citizens and the local authorities and their governance structures. I think people think about just resetting the table sometimes, but you can't just reset the table with people on the inside and the outside. You really need the data, you need the criteria, and you need to have that participation really deep and grounded in that. So thank you very much. I'll look forward to asking a lot of questions about the dashboard with the red, yellow, and the green lights. That looks very interesting. Our next panelist is Mónica Villegas, and she comes from Bogota. She is the director of Bogota Como Vamos. If you don't already know the Como Vamos networks of cities. You should. It's terrific work. It's grown from just a couple of cities a decade ago to, I think they're growing to about 45 this year. And they've been working on this issue of data collection for local authorities and for better policy making as well. And I think it'll be an interesting spin on what the governor just shared with us. So, Monica, you have 14 minutes according to my watch.
Okay.
Gracias, Ana María. Bueno.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Hi, good afternoon to all of you. I'm very happy to be here and share the experience of Bogota and how we're doing in Colombia and Latin America as well. My presentation, please. For us to develop a periodic or regular measurement, we have to have the stronger public policies, much more coherent and aligned to the needs of the city and the most immediate environment. Who are we? We are a citizenry action, periodic and systematic involvement in changes of society, promote a government that will be transparent and effective. Second objective is to promote an involvement of the citizenry, and the third is to promote partnership regarding quality of life. Our principles are interest for the public, quality of information, objectiveness, impartiality, autonomy, participation or involvement, alliances, networking, communication, and the commitment that we have in the city. We have been 17 years doing quality of life measurements in the city of Bogota. A brief context why this program came about. Back in 1997, in Colombia, we had a lot of campaign promises that were not fulfilled. Low accountability from our governors, very little citizenry involvement because of the lack of fulfillment of these objectives that had been presented to the society, and development plans without clear rules or goals. Fulfillment of election campaign promises opened the space to ask for accountability throughout processes of communication and collective communication links. A context that seemed very important for me to highlight, it's specific to Colombia, and that made possible this kind of exercises. Back in 1991, we reformed our political constitution, opening the possibility of programmatic vote and give participation to the different entities. In the case of Bogota, we had continuity in policies, mayors that work under the methodology that build over what has been built. 388 law 977 that forces all the cities of our country. Those plans should be 12 years scope, and they had to be built looking forward to those 12 years. And 152 law that forced all governments to build development plans with clear goals for municipality. This resulted in better management for the city. In the past, we had the highest violence rate. Consumption of water supply was quite complex for the city. Incomes improved for the city of Bogota. So Bogota, how are we doing? 97, it is constituted with the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, with the Corona Foundation that promotes citizenry involvement, and within time, the Casa Editorial, which is one of the most important media in Bogota and in the country. 2010, we have the Javeriana University that is a thought institution for the exercise that we are undertaking. Back in 1997, we started to came about another series of exercise of how we are doing. And right now, we have 15 cities that are undertaking this exercise, and we are creating this network of This is allowing us not only to think towards local, but also to think at a macro level. These exercises are already considering 50% of total population, which enables us to have an influence on urban policies at a national level. This exercise that how we are doing started to grow in Latin America. We have the Latin American Network. We are 10 countries, approximately 70 cities that have put into place this exercise how we are doing, or the alike. We have Sao Paulo, Rio. Here we have Jalisco, how we are doing, Mexico City, how we are doing, and another series of exercises, and we are trying to work hard throughout the network to support us at a Latin American level and to see what is going on with the quality of life of all citizenry. In the context of Bogota, something that's important, we are around 8 million inhabitants. We are 10% of the national population, 25% of the population of teenagers in Bogota, 20,000 persons of square meter. We are one of the most dense cities worldwide, not only Latin America. 786,000 inhabitants in poverty conditions, second most unequal city after Medellin, 0,502. We contribute 24.7 of the GDP. And then we have the political administrative division, and this is very important, and I will tell you why. Follow-up, we have a multidimensional concept throughout a ring methodology. The ring of the individuals are highly related to health, education, jobs, and a second one that's urban habitat. Here we include mobility, environmental sustainability, climate change, and risk. Third ring related to culture, citizenry accountability, recreational leisure, good government for the fourth ring. Public finances and administrative management in the city, economic and development and competitiveness of the city, it goes in fifth. We have two transversal, inequity and poverty, and demography, which are transversal for these 5 rings that I've just mentioned. So at this moment in time, we have been working for 17 years now. When we have indicators of objectives, Bogota has 400 indicators integrated in 14 sectors of the city that I've mentioned. We measure according to the progress of quality of life and the actions undertaken by the government on the territory on equity levels. We have subjective indicators that measure through a survey citizenry perception, what the citizens feel, and see the quality of life in the city. It is very important because on the one hand, we see hard data, how we are doing on quality of life in the city, regardless of the exercise that the public administration is doing. Those are indicators that go beyond local administrations. And on the other hand, we also can control the perception of the citizens. To state an example, in Bogota, the perception of security is quite high, but we have some hard indicators that are showing that security is improving. So this enables us to have very important analysis and focus on public policy. However, it is true that we are carrying out this macro exercise at the city level. We have seen the importance of not only producing those data, but to work with the most vulnerable territories so they can make the information their own and create throughout their policies a benefit and co-responsibility of the citizenry vis-a-vis the policies of the city. This is very important, as well as the sustainability of the exercise. If we go to localities, then we work with leaders that have capabilities already installed in the city. They have an empiric knowledge that is very important, but they lack the knowledge of the indicators, which are quite complex, and therefore communication with the administration is quite low. That's why we go with our information, we empower the citizens, so at the end they can have incidence or influence on their territories. This is very important. I was telling you that Bogota has 20 areas in their administrative political boundaries. Per locality, we have 200 indicators, and per locality enables us to fight inequality or in those according to those indicators. Some of the tools that we have used so far for innovation to have an influence on the city's policies, on the one hand, since last year, 2014, we have put in place an open data platform. At that moment, the city does not have an open data platform. The people does not have easy access to public information. Bogota, how we are doing all this information that he has been managing for these 17 years, hard indicators and perception indicators, and all the citizens can have access to open data, download the bases, the tables, and use Bogota information. This open data enable us to create applications for developers with interest on social topics and from hard data and objective data of the city. Likewise, this year we have launched to create a pilot with a social advancement index that has been created to measure those. And we are applying this index at the interior of Bogota per locality. It has been very interesting to carry out this program because development of cities are being measured by economic indicators, but you put aside all those indicators of opportunities that in our cities are so complex, or indicators related to sustainable development. And this index enables us to measure social progress in our cities. And last tool that we have been used are population analysis. Traditionally, life quality is measured by sector, as we do so. But now we wanted to go to a different approach, a differential one. We see the absence of information that the city has in order to measure how the quality of life of the population is doing. We did a first approach with children, and we realized that to design a public policy and understand how they are making progress, because you don't have the information at population level. So part of our exercise is to put this absence in view at a population level, differential level, in order to start having an impact much focused on the populations in the cities and improve their quality of life. And last, conclude Bogota, how we are doing. We have a commitment to measure the advances of ODS, making analysis of its indicators. We have a lot of indicators that in Bogota, like in a network, we have in common with the ODS. And that is why our challenge is, on the one hand, at this moment in Colombia, we are having local elections. So the mayor for the next year that will be developing its development plan will incorporate these SDGs indicators, so we can see how achievement has been accomplished, and from then have the empowerment of citizenry so they can learn and make the follow-up of how those advancements are doing in their localities. I think that's on my behalf, that is it, and then we will continue with questions.
Thank you. I think those two presentations back powerful. And it's a nice segue from what the Secretary General was saying this morning about having to measure more than just GDP. We really need to measure more than what's just evident and what's easy to measure. So often we value what we measure and we're not measuring what we actually value. And so it's not enough data for our local authorities to make good action plans that are based on not just the objective data. There you go, Monica, you're finished. Not just the objective data, but also the perceptions of what the community thinks. Our next speaker has come all the way from the UK, and we're very appreciative. It's the Honorable David Lammy. He was elected as the youngest member of Parliament back in 2000, and he has really worked hard to represent his constituency, which is actually the most heterogeneous, I think, in the City of London, and as heterogeneous, a lot of recent immigrants and a very diverse community. And so you've heard a lot of different approaches, both from the big macro level, the global organizations like the IDB, and then from a governor and a civic organization that's doing a lot of work. What do you think works from your perspective? What has been helpful? How do you scale? What do you pay attention to?
Well, look, I'm not going to go and stand at the platform. I'm just going to respond to some of what I've heard.
Terrific.
As obviously a member of the UK Parliament in London, representing a constituency. My constituency is Tottenham. And the way I would describe Tottenham, it's a constituency now. It's a sort of 3-mile area in the north of London. Some of you may know because we have one of the best football teams in the Premiership, Tottenham Hotspur. Some people think in London it's Arsenal, but it's not, it's Tottenham. And in that constituency are over 200 languages are spoken. It is the part of London where if people leave developing countries, if they leave parts of Eastern Europe, if they are fleeing Syria, Libya, parts of Northern Africa, the place that they are likely to arrive is into my constituency. And this is I think it's important to put the challenge for cities into perspective in terms of livability, even though it's easy to see London as one of the world's great global cities in which the streets are paved with gold. Clearly, if you are leaving Lagos, Nigeria, or if you are Kurdish, fleeing parts of Syria, and making your way to London, what you are escaping to in London is preferable to what you left behind. But there are huge challenges now for economies like the UK, just as there are in cities like New York, cities like Berlin, and I just want to describe some of those issues that are facing us. The first thing to say is that 4 years ago, some of you might remember that very surprisingly, in August, it was the summer before London put on the Olympics, you switched on your television screens and you saw rioting beginning, and rioting that went on for 4 days across the United Kingdom. That rioting begun in my constituency. I think this is significant. We're seeing real profound problems in the United States of America at the moment. We've seen rioting in cities like Sydney in Australia. We've also seen rioting in Sweden. Now, in terms of the well-being agenda, if you've got rioting in Sweden, something is going on that we need to get underneath. And I think that there are 2 revolutions that have an impact on developed economies. The first revolution is the 1960s social revolution. The revolution that gives us rights, of course, that we associate very much with left-wing parties, right equality for women, for minorities, for black men and women. And of course it, in many ways, is the human rights agenda that empowers so many people across the world. It's the liberal revolution of the 1960s. The second is the 1980s economic liberal revolution. That's the revolution of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. to some extent continued by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. Now, both of these two quiet revolutions in economies like the United Kingdom and the USA collide. And what we find is it's great to be aware of your rights, but it's also important to be aware of your responsibilities. Your right to eat has led to 3.8 million people in London being obese. When we looked at some of the rioting that was going on, it seemed that the young people felt that they had a right to that Nike pair of trainers. So you smash into the shop window and you get that a right to participate in this global economy. And of course, the 1980s social revolution and economic liberal revolution, another freedom, the freedom you might interpret sometimes to make as much money as you want, unregulated, has led to a huge housing problem in cities like London. So what are you escaping to when you leave a developing country to arrive in London? Well, let me summarize. We're now moving towards a 10 million population in which there is a huge housing crisis. Effectively, we are not building sufficient public housing, and London is not a city with rent control. So rents are soaring in London as they are soaring in Manhattan. It's interesting, Angela Merkel ran on rent control when she was last elected because it's an issue also in Germany. As people drive and of course the real concern that in the city you create deep ghettos. There's also a challenge on architecture and density and building high, dense, tall buildings, and a lack of space. Our children are growing up in some very, very small environments indeed. It used to be that the real progressive value was education. Increasingly, it's not just what happens in schools. If you haven't got sufficient room to revise or prepare, there are real issues in relation to housing now in our cities. The environmental and sustainability agenda is massive. How do you retrofit very old buildings in cities like Paris and London that are hundreds and hundreds of years old? How do you make them environmentally friendly? How do you fit the solar panels? How do you ensure that they are carbon neutral? The cost of that for the state is extensive. It's also important we're facing real issues with the amount of people who are choosing to cycle because of the cost of transport and the amount of deaths that causes. How do you keep lorries and HGVs out of the city if they need to deliver goods for restaurants, for shops and other things? How do you create the 24-hour city in which things maybe arrive late at night, but in which you don't want big lorries waking people up as they are sleeping? We need also to move, it would seem, to electric cars in the city. France, in Paris, has made big steps in their Autolibre towards moving to the electric car, pedestrianizing large chunks of the city so that people can get the city back and can have the city that they want to belong to. But the real challenge, of course, remains the labour market. 1 in 4 young people unemployed in the City of London, and a real challenge with the quality of jobs. And not the minimum wage, which we introduced, we have a minimum wage, but a living wage. What is a living wage? How do we stop the situation in which many, many families are doing 2-3 jobs, running a minicab, increasingly in cities like London, that is an Uber, running an Uber, being a cleaner, being a security guard, all at the same time. Who is raising the children whilst this is happening? And what is the economic effect of that if you aren't able to have a living wage? That is a very real debate. And interestingly, in Britain, it is a debate in which both the left and the right are participating, with David Cameron and George Osborne, our Chancellor, also saying that they believe and want to move forward with a living wage. So, labour market challenges, real issues around environment, around standards in terms of tall buildings, and of course, the prescient issue of inequality. And let me just end there. Right across New York, right across London, right across Paris, you can see huge cranes building wonderful, wonderful apartments. The problem for local populations is they are not building those apartments for you. They are building those apartments for the global rich, whether they are coming from the Middle East, whether they are coming from China, whether they are coming from Russia. I met a Chinese man the other day, and he said to me, I've just bought a wonderful flat, 3-bedroom flat in the centre of London for my son, who is going to go to the London School of Economics. And I said to him, well, that is a wonderful university. What is he studying? When does he start? And this Chinese gentleman said to me, no, he hasn't started, he's only 2. Well, there are 30 million middle-class Chinese. If they all choose to buy flats in London, we've got some serious issues. I'll end there.
Everybody off, so I appreciate that. That gives us almost half an hour for questions and answers and nice dialogue now. I want to check with our organizers to see how many mics we have. We have 1 mic, we have 1 mic. Okay, great. So what I would like to do is take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and then we're going to have questions over here, and then we'll go back and forth. We have our mic right over here, so if we have a couple of people that are ready to ask questions, we can go there. Anybody have an urgent question? There we go, we'll go over here, and then the next question will be, anybody else? No? Okay, maybe if, great, and then we'll go over there. If when you ask your question, can you please identify yourself? Thank you. And if you can make your questions true questions, and also short, so we can ask lots of them. Thank you.
Ok. ¿Yo empiezo?
Por favor.
So I'll go first. I am Clara Husigman. I come from Incide Social. This is civil society conducting surveys on violence in cities, in Mexico particularly. And I would like to ask Mr. Medina Plasencia, who make up the citizen councils? How do they choose this type of councils or boards, and in how many cities have they applied the standard that you have passed? Juan, I would like to know what happens when local governments do not have the capacity of governance. Oftentimes there is a centralization, and there are a number of attributions that they cannot exercise. And beyond that, they have real estate companies that are very powerful, that are giving rise to a bundle or to a problem, at least in my country, with respect to the growth at the cities. And Mexican urbanization has been disastrous in the past 30 years. Well, we have 29 cities currently where the observatory is in force. Out of those, approximately 9 of them are in Mexico. The Citizen Observatory in León was the result of an initiative of the International Foundation for Trustworthy Governments. And since I live there, we had an opportunity for the municipal authority to accept the fostering of this observatory. And initially, we looked for stakeholders from the community, starting with some mayors from different political parties, PRI and PAN, and they made up the executive committee of this foundation. It currently has 17 members at the executive board and 170 board members in total. We are looking for the representation at the board of the observatory of all the bodies of communities, starting with universities that take active part with leaders of the community in order to conduct this joint work with the government. This is a social organization independent from the municipal government. Even though in the original there was a seat capital from the municipal government, it is currently self-financed. Yo quiero hacer...
Given that the Sustainable Development Goals were just ratified or approved in New York last month, and it's an unprecedented opportunity for us as civil society, as philanthropy, the private sector, the multilaterals, and all of governance, and to really work in different ways. It's going to build on the Millennium Development Goals in big ways, and it's going to allow us to really work around not just governance and planning, but what our colleague was talking about, civic participation and multi-stakeholder partnerships in different ways. Often, having worked in federal government and also in local government, I see that we do really strong efforts at this civic participation, but it's really hard to get to the informal economy. It's really hard to get to the recent immigrants, the people that are going to your part of London. It's really difficult to get them, especially around urban planning efforts that are forward-looking. It's more easy to get them involved in the today problems. So I'm wondering if our panelists, to add on to your question, ma'am, have any thoughts about how do you really get to those different levels of participation that is so hard to get to? Thoughts? For anybody?
Gracias. Disculpe, yo creo que usted hizo una pregunta que no se...
I think that your question has not been answered, and that is, what does the bank do when governance of a city is weak? And how can we protect cities from stakeholders that are powerful? So to give you a short answer, and you are quite right, because I would dare to say that most of our middle-sized cities have a relative governance. We have to work more extensively, a lot harder, I would say. That happens due to a transparent fiscal management, and when you incorporate technology and when you start eliminating paper and everything goes into the computer, then it is amazing to see how the governments transform. Now, what you mentioned is very important. When a local government has a weak governance vis-a-vis a strong stakeholder, there is a symmetry in terms of management, a symmetry for the management of information in favor of the stronger party. That is where citizen involvement can achieve things that would take even longer if the governance of a city is not progressing. And the civil society can act as a deterrent. And we work hand in hand with Bogotá Como Vamos, and in our program, we try at the end to incorporate a citizen involvement program similar to what they have been doing. and we work with the civil society together with a local university. I'm not going to mention the cities, but in 2 Mexican cities where we've worked, we have stopped urban development projects that were going to affect the aquifer and were going to provoke far more severe problems in the near future.
Question? How do you lift up, please?
The question is very interesting, I believe, because I think that this is a problem common in Latin America. And in the case of Bogota, we have a current problem with citizen participation spaces. On the one hand, they have been taken by certain groups of people who are management, those groups and those spaces, and you find them in the different spaces that are open. And so we have the same stakeholders, the same people who are taking part and have these spaces taken over. And there is therefore a discouragement to take part, because people feel that they take part but they never have an effect of what is important for them. And then they are a highly politicized arena that does not open or gives an open space for the voice of citizens. So when we go to these local areas, we try to work with more vulnerable people, but we find that they are vulnerable and they do not go to these participation spaces, and they then are controlled by the same group. So we have not yet solved this challenge. We are currently facing this. We have to work hard. We have to cope with this. It is a challenge for the civil society, but also for the government, in order to improve governments and in order to bring these people to the table. The main reasons, as we asked people when we wonder why didn't they participate, they said because there are no spaces of participation that I know of. That is number one. And number two, I don't understand what for if my voice is never heard. So that is a topic that is not yet solved, and it's a quite complex problem that we have that we need to solve in one way or another. We have another question. My question is for Carlos Medina Plasencia. I think that your presentation is very important. I was checking your website a little while ago, but I would like to hear the route on how to have access to training and to the observatory. If I am a municipality, how can I have access to these benefits and to training efforts that are being fostered by you, and therefore have an effect on a more efficient public policy? I am Israel Hernández Jiménez from Consultoría Acciones Integrales para Transformar. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to tell you that I had to leave the head of the foundation this last March because I was a candidate again as síndico in León, Guanajuato. The current head of the foundation is Carlos Gasque, who was one of the people who collaborated with me as mayor and governor in the strengthening of municipalities, and that is where this proposal was made to the ISO, that we submitted to the ISO, so that it had to pay attention on governments. And the first reply was, what do we have to do with that? And we said, well, that the companies that you are certifying are in a community where there are water problems, security, lighting problems, and a number of things. And you need to see whether governments where those companies are actually have the right conditions.
You can go directly to Dr. Gaston. You have the contact information at our website, International organization of reliable governments, and they can help you out with the design of what you may require as citizenry observatory, as well as in the training inside the government and the observatory itself of how to carry out this task. The program of how we are doing in Monterrey is one of the things that is working in Monterrey Observatory in the state of Nuevo León. All those institutions that are interested that are going to get involved in the follow-up of works of those indicators in order to ensure that the government will be reliable to the extent that the light is green. If you want more information, I'd be more than glad to give you more information in a little while. Creo que
Mari no se oye.
Sir, would you like to identify yourself? And then, did we have another person for another question? Thank you. Go ahead.
Hola.
Hi, I am Carlos Brown. I am consultant on local policy. My question is regarding the new Millennium Objectives and this idea that what is measurable is viable. And my question is for Monica. Monica, my first part of the question is, how do you face the gaps at a local level? Because we have very good measurements at a domestic level in order to give the follow-up on ODS, and that was a problem with the previous objectives of the millennium. And what contribution is the bank going to be doing in order to follow up the SDGs goals? Entonces vamos a tomar todas las...
Thank you. My name is Pam Flatto, and I have a question for LS1 as well. You mentioned energy efficiency being worked into the indicators that you've developed under the environment and climate change scenario for urban development. And I was wondering if you could just give some idea of what those might be or what they hope to be, and also to ask the same question to Mr. Plasencia regarding the goals of his organization.
Terrific, thank you. Regarding energy efficiency and climate change, and what would be done differently given the integration of the project. Yeah. Would we start with Mónica? Yeah.
Sí, bueno, sí, usted tiene toda la razón. Tenemos tenemos una situación y la verdad es que en el caso de Bogotá contamos con muy buena información a diferencia de otras ciudades. Inclusive Bogotá muchas veces cuenta con mejor información que a nivel nacional, ¿sí? Digamos, ya ha habido un trabajo y una evolución tal que la ciudad cuenta, pero definitivamente para poder medir los nuevos objetivos de desarrollo sostenible hay un vacío de información de indicadores que parte de nuestro ejercicio, lo que hemos hablado con las Naciones Unidas, es ver cómo desde los ejercicios, cómo vamos, podemos, digamos, impulsar y apoyar también a los gobiernos locales para generar esta información. Hay un tema que es muy importante, que es una reflexión, es que cuando se establecieron los ODM, se establecieron los objetivos a nivel país. Por ejemplo, para el caso de Bogotá ya había cumplido muchos de los objetivos cuando se habían planteado, entonces para nosotros no era un reto cumplir con los objetivos del milenio. En este caso lo que se está exigiendo es que las metas sean aterrizadas a los contextos locales, tema que es sumamente importante y de todas maneras, claro, van a haber huecos, van a haber vacíos, pero parte justamente como ejercicio ciudadano y la incidencia que nosotros tenemos que tener ahí es hacer presión para que los gobiernos locales generen esta información. Por ejemplo, temas como cambio climático, todavía hay un vacío inmenso. Nosotros hemos hecho mesas de trabajo con la administración distrital y todavía realmente no saben cómo lo van a medir. Están pensando en un índice. Nosotros tenemos algunas preguntas en nuestra encuesta de percepción ciudadana que ellos toman como base, pero todavía realmente no tenemos solucionado cómo medir ese tipo de aspectos. Ahí está justamente uno de los retos.
Let me address first the question from the lady in Washington. If I understood correctly, the question was on climate change. How do we embed that into the planning process? And then energy efficiency. As part of the methodology, we run what we call 3 base studies. One is the inventory of green gas house emissions. So we know in what part of the city can we make the investments that would yield the better savings in the emissions. No wonder it's obviously on public transportation, no? 60% of the greenhouse emissions in our cities is energy related. Of that 60%, about 57 is car and just burning gas. The second base study is the way in which the urban footprint is evolving. We use your reference techniques and we go back 30 years just to see how did that, like the Tegucigalpa example that I was mentioning to you, and then we go 30 years forward. And in the 30 years forward, we run different scenarios. The third one is the vulnerability analysis. And remember that I was telling you about how this migration settles wherever they can, wherever the cost of the land is lower, sometimes no cost at all, and those are the more vulnerable areas. So we laid the vulnerability analysis and we're able to tell the mayor, if you keep on expanding the city in this way, this is the amount of environmental liabilities you're going to be creating, not counting the loss of human life. So we've been embedding that, and it's acting like a great filter into where should we put the money to invest in a particular city. On the energy efficiency, it's a very relevant question. Most of our intermediate cities, maybe not the capital, but most of our intermediate cities are still today in public lighting and public offices using old technology. And it's incredible, but it has to do with a regulatory issue. So we run a study within the plan where we're able to tell them, listen, this is your benchmark today. This is how much energy you're consuming, how many kilowatts multiplied times the price. This is the impact on your budget. If you migrate to a newer technology, LED or whatever, this will be your new benchmark. That, from an engineering point of view, is a very easy question to answer. Where we have the challenge now is how do we monetize that saving so the city has sufficient budget to be able to make the investment in the migration to the newer technology. And we've been working in Mexico since about 5 or 6 years, and it's incredible. The regulatory framework is a big hassle. No? We've been having more successful cases in other countries in Latin America. But it's a way forward. I have no doubt that will happen, and at least in public lighting in public office buildings, the migration will be there in the next 5 years.
La otra pregunta, la verdad que no entendí bien la última parte.
The other question, I did not understand properly. I don't know if it was about the objectives and how we use information. Because at this moment in time, we have 140 indicators in those 3 dimensions. If you recall the presentation, we are mentioning 36 more on competitiveness and employment. And we are trying to put all this on an open database that will be of access to the public. As Monica was saying, it's not the entire solution for the objectives. We need to clarify and add more indicators maybe. But what hampers that we already have 180, and it is very heavy to manage. Just remember that these indicators are the cities do not have them. We have to build them, and sometimes we have to build them about public opinion polls. Sometimes we send the technicians to make a measurement And it is not as simple as that, because not all the cities have those indicators readily available. So we do believe that information is vital in order to make intelligent decisions afterwards. Me encantó eso.
I'm going to finish off then one last question, which I will offer to our elected officials. Fast forward 20 years. What will we be doing differently in 20 years if we're really serious about building livable, inclusive, sustainable cities and regions? From your perspective, what would you offer to the next member of parliament, to the next governor?
I think that in the context of a city like London, we have the challenge of population growth and ensuring equality across all income groups. And I think that's going to be a tremendous challenge. And if we don't get it right, we are going to see more social unrest and difficulty in the years ahead. I suspect that cities in the West, you'll see more urban sprawl. They will get bigger and have to grow outwards. But at the same time, with sustainability, you don't just want lots of concrete jungles. At the moment, a city like London is doing well on...
Podemos nosotros hacer frente, pero es importante encontrar y...
But the real challenge, I think, will be one of equity. It will be returning to this subject of what is a living wage, and whether you see governments prepared to legislate for a living wage so that you have a minimum standard, if you like, that's required. I think the flashing forward 20 years, I think policymakers will be met with increasing pressures around technology and the way technology is disrupting the market. This may be simplistic, but actually something like Uber is a real threat to taxi drivers and industries in cities, and the idea that anyone can arrive in a city, get a quick license and be able to take someone around is a problem, and it's a problem for pollution. And cities like Paris, New York and London are taking that very seriously. But also Airbnb. New York banned Airbnb. The hotel industry went mad. The idea that ordinary people can just rent out their homes for free and bypass the hotel market. So you've got serious sectors disrupted. One last element I think that we see in London, and this is very, very real. It is the problem of money laundering and dirty money. Parking your money if you have illegal gotten gains in the City of London through offshore companies. So now almost 11% of the centre of London, we do not know who owns the property. This is a real problem. Why is it a problem? Because it's driving up property values, which inevitably drives up property values for the very, very poorest. That's something also that policymakers will need to legislate against. Much more transparency, much more openness about who owns what. One last thing, it is totally unacceptable that a company like Facebook is paying £4,000 in tax in the United Kingdom. £4,000. You heard it, despite 10 billion profits. Offshore, we need to challenge it.
From Carlos, and thank you.
I recall that Jaime Lermer, the mayor of Curitiba, with his wisdom saying, the matter is to resolve the equation of accountability. That is to say, I do not imagine government separate from society in the government task. everything that society has to define on mobility, on sustainability, and everything that the society has to do to give an opinion on their environment, how they want to live. It has to be the opinion of the society heard and organizing all that energy of the society by the government. To govern is to conduct. It's not to order. It's not to impose. It's to organize the society, and that's how imagine within 20 years' time, society making the decision under that government's model.
IADB, 20 years from now, what will you do differently? 1 minute or less.
I think the bank doesn't run that risk. No, I think we development banks are starting to learn that the time where to be effective and have an impact in development was the time of the large public policies, national policies and so on, and the big national loans and so on. I think it's fading. No? I think we now understand, if we are in a urbanized world, that we need to take our policies a lot closer to the citizen. We really need to start working very close to them, with the local governments to improve their governance and to improve their fiscal standings, but also with the other stakeholders, with civil society, with local universities. Very important. I mean, education is a very important ingredient. With the private sector, there's a lot of good, responsible private sector out there that wants to work with us. So I think the way development institutions are seeing this work at the city level now is like the next phase, and that's where we really should concentrate and also learn from the stakeholders what they really need, what they really want, and what works. This development equation is not really that easy, but hopefully we'll get there sometime. Thank you.
Thank you. Monica, you have the last word. You also have a magic wand, but you only have 30 seconds. What would you do differently?
Mira, yo coincido definitivamente.
I do agree with everybody. I do think that the challenge is to go by governments as a theoric topic, because we believe that this what really has to be in the practice. I think the future of public policy in the cities is work hand in hand with the citizenry. That is the only way that you will have less inequality in the cities. Citizenry exercises like dialogue with the citizenship is still difficult for us. So the great challenge is to see how we can really go from the theory of governance to the practice of governance in our cities.
Really educated us, but they have also thrown the challenge back at us, making it very clear that you can't have inclusive, livable, sustainable cities, regions, if we don't all work together as partners at the table to get everybody's input and engagement and better policy making. That has to be a joint table, to all of us working together. So I invite you all to a round of applause for this wonderful panels, and thank you very much for having us.